This video is about different types of planting stock. Planting stock just refers to the type of plant that you get from the grower or the nursery. It's going to vary based on where you're located because not every type of stock is available in every region and what species you're looking for. There are some types of stock that aren't covered in the study guide, so I'll go over them really quickly. They're not going to be applicable to most situations. The first one is direct seeding, where you take the seed of the tree and you put out in the landscape. You're not going to get a lot of immediate effect, and you're going to have some issues like germination rate, whether the seed gets eaten, things like that, but it's the least expensive way of getting a tree. Then you have liner plants or seedlings, where the seed has been germinated and grown into a little plant. This cuts out the germination issues, and you can start a very small tree in the landscape in the spring, so it has a head start over the seed. This is more common in reforestation efforts, like after a wildfire or logging. Then you have cuttings, where you take a branch of a tree and you stick it in the ground, and that's it. This works with very few trees, mainly willows and poplars. As long as the soil is moist, that branch will root. Now, on to the types of planting stock that you're more likely to encounter as an arborist. The first one is bare root. A bare root tree is exactly what it sounds like. These trees are planted from seedlings or smaller trees into a field and grown into the size that they want to sell. At that point, they get dug up and the soil is removed from their roots. They're stored in cool, moist conditions because it's really important that the tree doesn't start growing when its roots are bare. Fruit trees and smaller plants like strawberries are commonly found bare root. The benefit is that it's usually cheaper because you're not shipping all the soil with the plant. And when the plant is put in the landscape, there's no texture change in the soil between the roots and what's native. Since you can see all the roots, you can also cut out dead or problematic roots like anything that's circling and girdling. The downside is because the trees are being dug out of the field, they do lose a lot of their roots, especially their small roots. They're also offered only during the dormant season, and you have to plant them during the dormant season as well. The next type of stock is called balled-in burlap or B&B. The tree is grown in the field and it is dug up with the root ball and a native soil. The root ball is then wrapped with burlap and twine or wire, which keeps the root ball moist and holds the soil together so it doesn't fall apart. You can get both deciduous and evergreen trees in B&B form, but the availability is going to vary based on where you live. Maybe the land is a little bit too expensive to grow trees in the ground for years. The benefits are that the trees are planted outside in the ground, so they're getting used to the conditions that they would face when they're planted in the landscape. Because they're exposed to wind, their branches and trunks will develop more taper than a nursery tree that's confined by a stake. Because the trees are planted from smaller plants or seedlings, you will still have root defects that originated in the small pot phase. But when they're grown out in the field, some of the worst defects will kill off those trees. Overall, you may have a better chance of getting less defective roots, but it's not 100%. The downsides are that the tree will face some kind of shock because a lot of its roots will be cut when that root ball is dug up. The tree overall is also going to be heavier because mineral soil from the field is much heavier than the growing media that they use for the container plants. You also have to handle the ball and burlap plants more carefully because you don't want to leave too much of the wire or the twine on the root ball and the burlap because they can limit root growth to some extent, but you also don't want to take them off if the soil is not stable. If you accidentally lose part of the soil in the root ball, you will also lose roots with it. The next type of stock is container grown. Container grown plants start in containers and stay there their whole life. They get potted up in the next container size as they outgrow their current one. They tend to be more available year-round, which means you can plant them within a larger time window, unlike the other two types whose availability is more related to their dormancy. You do have to properly care for them after they're planted in the landscape because there will be a transition phase from the fertilizing and watering that the nursery is giving to what a homeowner might be able to give. Container grown trees are also grown in a lightweight medium or a substrate that's made of a variety of materials that mimic soil, but it's not actually soil. It could have things like peat moss, coconut coir, pumice, vermiculite, compost, and other things that are intended to provide a lightweight, well-draining potting mix. Because the substrate is lightweight, it's going to be much easier to handle than a balled and burlap tree. Since the tree has stayed in the container its whole life, it has the majority of its root system intact, so it won't have transplant shock like the other trees that get dug up. The drawbacks of this type of stock is that there is a strong possibility for root issues. When trees are grown in a container and they're not moved up to the next container size quickly enough, the roots will hit the side of the container, turn, and start growing along the perimeter of that container. Those are called circling roots. If those circling roots are close to the trunk, those are called girdling roots because eventually they will girdle or choke that trunk. If those roots are not cut, you get a accumulation of those issues for every single pot that tree ends up being in. And these defects you can't see unless you take all the potting mix off. They also tend to be crowded together and supported by stakes. So this means that they're not accustomed to the stresses that field-grown trees are accustomed to, and they will need to be supported by stakes when they get planted. If the environment that the trees are grown are really hot or really cold, the roots could be damaged by extreme conditions because they're not being insulated in the ground. There is a difference between container grown and containerized stock. Containerized stock refers to plants that have been grown in the field and then transplanted into a pot or another container.